Newspapers and magazines are losing huge amounts of revenue as advertising goes off to Google and Facebook. And so they just don't have the journalists to write about this stuff often. I wrote this piece based on my research before the conference, looking at the media coverage and after it. It looked at the various different ways this happens, some of which are more honest from the media and some of which are maybe more dishonest. So, for example, in the New Statesman, which is, a generally good magazine, I think it's at the better end of this, they had the only coverage of kind of energy or climate issues they had before the conference was a piece of what's called sponsored content by EDF, the big French energy company, who are major polluters. They have the filthiest coal power stations in Europe, about how nuclear power is the solution to the climate crisis. And of course, there's reasonable people who can disagree about what you think about nuclear power. You might have different positions on that. But the fact that the main sort of magazine in the British left only had one way to cover this issue, which was getting a major corporation to tell them the answer, was very worrying about our media landscape. The second is what I call advertising and coincidental coverage, where there would be a sort of advert for a company here, and then a couple of pages later, there'd be a sort of weird puff piece about that company or about, how you should do a thing that that company would want that wouldn't normally, you'd think, make a newspaper. So, for example, one paper had an advert for an airline and then a whole article that would just kind of wrote about how this airline makes sure that you get exactly the food you want and how it has this clever software system. I mean, all you need is a spreadsheet. It's not that complicated to make sure that customers get the food they want. So it was kind of a very strange, coincidence that this airline had bought a whole page of coverage and suddenly there's this, article about how great they are. Or another one was like a magazine which was advertising shares in crude oil. There was an advert for that, and then there was their financial advisor was saying that now is the time to buy shares in crude oil, which of course is very worrying. You think about, your grandparents and maybe their pension money and how they could be suddenly throwing it into something which turned out to be terrible advice. Is this guy saying that you should do that because that's what he believes or because the advertiser has told them? And then there are various other examples of this, but perhaps the most pernicious was about this story in the Daily Mail, I think it was, which said that there'd be blackouts if we had too much renewable energy, and that this winter we were looking at blackouts because of how much renewable energy there was. But it turned out that the tabloid press has run that story every year for 6 years based on basically the same report that's been essentially copied and pasted by a right-wing think tank making the same claim every year. And in that period, there have been no blackouts caused by renewable energy coverage. So they have this same scaremongering story placed there by a right-wing think tank who won't tell you who's paying for their work to get the story into the papers, which terrifies people about the dangers of renewable energy. And so I suppose what worried me about all of that is it shows how rich organisations, and of course rich in this case largely because they're linked to the fossil fuel industry, one of the richest industries in the world, can shape the way we talk about energy policy, we talk about environmental policy through a kind of dying media that doesn't have the journalists to fact check stuff anymore. And that means that all of the narratives, all the stories we hear about this stuff are often put there by big business. The week before the conference, the Telegraph sacked this guy, Jeff Lean, who had been the UK's first dedicated environmental correspondent. That journalists are losing their jobs rapidly and things like climate change often lose, reporters first. So there weren't nearly enough journalists, and the ones there were, what they spent their time doing, understandably, was following the actual negotiations in the room very closely. But of course, anyone who knows about politics understands that no decision is really made in the room. And what we found is, we went to, for example, an oil industry event, and we were the only journalists in the world at this oil industry event, where we basically got, Shell to say that, sure, in public we're saying one thing, but actually what they believe in private is, a set of quite different things. So they pretended to support the aims of the Paris Climate Conference, which are that they, a 2-degree cap on carbon emissions. But Shell's balance sheet relies on saying, well, these are the assets, these reserves that we have. So how can they possibly say they support a 2-degree cap, which would in fact make them bankrupt as a company? And and Shell's head of climate change said to me, well, they don't really think there will be a 2-degree cap, and actually like 3 or 4 degrees maybe is where we're going, and essentially admitted that what they were saying in public and what they were saying in private didn't quite stack up. So that ties in with some more recent revelations from Greenpeace and The Guardian, who kind of went undercover and did this sting on a think tank called the Institute for Economic Affairs. It turned out that one of the main funders of the IEA throughout the 1990s, and in fact for a very long time, has been BP. And throughout this period, the IEA were very actively involved in kind of spreading stories about how climate change wasn't really a thing. And, it wasn't, we shouldn't worry about climate change, and, basically climate denial stories. Throughout that period, BP changed their branding to Beyond Petroleum. They pretended to be the green company and so on. So all their marketing was, we understand this is a problem and we're going to solve it and so on. But quietly, they were also paying other people to say things they didn't want to say in public about how climate change isn't happening and spreading doubt and so on. And if we think about how the climate has changed now, and people have died this summer and will continue to die because of this, and how we didn't take the opportunity in the 90s and in the 80s when we knew about this problem, we think about how companies like BP pretended to care about this problem at the time, but in fact were also paying the people who were going around making sure that there was no action taken on this problem, then we see a huge problem in the way that political propaganda works in this company, and the fact that the media didn't really hold them to account at the time and still don't hold them to account. Ultimately, power in a country lies in the hands of the citizens of that country. And if we organise together, and we work hard and we understand what we're doing and we invest in the kind of media we need and we build our own movements, then we can see off these threats. These things aren't inevitable. All of these stories are in a way stories of hope, because ultimately what's happened is that we have managed to find these people trying to do these things. We have managed to expose them, and often, that's humiliated them enough in itself that it's in some ways stopped them doing those things, or at least slowed them and made it harder for them. So I think what's interesting that's changed in the last even 3 years is that we've seen this massive growth in alternative media outlets as people have started to realise they need to fund alternative media outlets to do this work. And in the environmental space, there's more and more great people doing that. Of course, us at Open Democracy do it, but also people like DSmog and lots of others have done some really important work holding this power to account and revealing these stories.